Hey everyone. As part of my thesis research on Trotskyist conceptions of the USSR, I've been reading a lot of books about Leon Trotsky. Um, and one of the books is The Ideas of Leon Trotsky, edited by Hillel Ticktin and Michael Cox. And the piece that I'm reading in this video is Michael Löwy's From the Logic of Hegel to the Finland Station in Petrograd. I should say, as you might have guessed from my disgusting sounds I just made, that I have a cold. Someone told me one time in a video that my coughs and hacking weren't endearing. They're not intended to be. I would much prefer not to cough. But I just can't be bothered. So here we go. The piece starts off with a couple quotes. Sorry, I should say this first. This article first appeared in Critique number 6, 1976. And remember, Michael Löwy is coming from the orthodox Trotskyist background. So here we are. From the logic of Hegel to the Finland Station in Petrograd. Starts with a quote. Quote, a man who talks that kind of stupidity is not dangerous, end quote. Stankovic, a socialist, 1917. So I was looking up Stankovic and or Stankovic, and I couldn't find anything. Next quote. Quote, that is raving, the ravings of a lunatic, end quote. Bogdanov, a Menshevik, April 1917. If he is referring to Alexander Bogdanov, that's not true. Alexander Bogdanov was not a Menshevik. Quote, their mad dreams, ... end quote. Plekhanov, a Menshevik, April 1917. Quote, for many years, the place of Bakunin in the Russian Revolution has remained vacant. Now it is occupied by Lenin, end quote. Goldenberg, an ex-Bolshevik, April 1917. Sorry, I was looking up Goldenberg. I don't see anything. Quote, on that day, bracket 4th of April, in bracket, Comrade Lenin could not find open sympathizers even in our own ranks, end quote. Zalezhky, a Bolshevik, April 1917. Wikipedia says Isaac Abramovich Zelensky lived from 1890 to 1938. Was a Soviet politician, Communist Party official, and a victim of the Great Purge. In 1929, he was briefly Secretary General of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic. Back to the text. Quote, as for the general scheme of Lenin, it seems to us unacceptable in that it starts from the assumption that the bourgeois democratic revolution is ended and counts upon an immediate transformation of this revolution into a socialist revolution, end quote. Kamenev, in an editorial in Pravda, organ of the Bolshevik Party, 8th of April, 1917. And Wikipedia says Lev Kamenev lived from 1883 to 1936. Lev Kamenev was a Russian revolutionary and Soviet politician. An old Bolshevik, Lev Kamenev was a leading figure in the early Soviet government, serving as the first head of state of the Russian SFSR as chairman of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, and as a deputy premier of the Soviet Union from 1923 to 1926, among other roles. Born in Moscow to a family active in revolutionary politics, Lev Kamenev joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1901 and sided with Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction after the party's 1903 split. Lev Kamenev was arrested several times and participated in the failed revolution of 1905, after which he moved abroad and became one of Lenin's close associates. In 1914, Lev Kamenev was arrested upon returning to St. Petersburg and exiled to Siberia. Lev Kamenev returned after the February Revolution of 1917, which overthrew the monarchy and joined Grigory Zinoviev in opposing Lenin's, quote, April Theses, and armed seizure of power known as the October Revolution. Nevertheless, he briefly served as the de facto head of state as chairman of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets and held a number of senior posts, including chairman of the Moscow Soviet and deputy premier under Lenin. In 1919, Kamenev was elected as a full member of the First Politburo. During Lenin's final illness in 1923-24, Kamenev formed a leadership troika with Zinoviev and Joseph Stalin, which led to Leon Trotsky's downfall. Stalin subsequently turned against his former allies and ousted Kamenev from the Soviet leadership, after which Kamenev and Zinoviev aligned with Trotsky in the united opposition against Stalin. Kamenev was removed from his position in 1926 and expelled from the party in 1927. Before submitting to Stalin's increasing power and rejoining the party the next year, he and Zinoviev were again expelled from the party in 1932, as a result of the Ryutin affair, and were readmitted in 1933. In 1934, Kamenev was arrested after the assassination of Sergei Kirov, accused of complicity in his killing, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Kamenev was later made a chief defendant in the trial of the 16, the show trial at the beginning of Stalin's Great Purge, found guilty of treason and executed in August 1936. Back to the text. Such was the unanimous reception accorded by the official representatives of Russian Marxism to the heretical theses which Lenin had presented first to the crowd amassed in the forecourt of the Finland station in Petrograd from the top of an armored car, and then, on the morrow, to the Bolshevik and Menshevik delegates of the Soviet, the April Theses. I just wanted to look at the Wikipedia for Finland stations real quick. St. Petersburg Finlandsky, also known as Finland Station, is a railway station in St. Petersburg, Russia, handling transport to westerly destinations including Helsinki and Viborg. The Finland Station is most famous for having been the location where Vladimir Lenin returned to Petrograd from exile in Switzerland on the 16th of April 1917, ahead of the October Revolution. The main entrance to the metro station, Plощad Lenina, is in the main building of Finland Station. Back to the text. In his celebrated memoirs, Sukhanov, a Menshevik later to become a Soviet functionary, testifies that Lenin's central political formula, quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote, quote, echoed like a thunderclap from a clear blue sky, end quote. And, quote, stunned and confused even the most faithful of his disciples, End quote. Wikipedia says Nikolai Sukhanov lived from 1882 to 1940 and was a Russian Menshevik internationalist and chronicler of the Russian Revolution. On the 29th of June 1940, he was convicted on false charges by the Soviet government and shot. After Stalin's death, Nikolai Sukhanov was rehabilitated. Back to the text. According to Sukhanov, one leading Bolshevik had even declared that, quote, the speech of Lenin had not sharpened the differences within the social democracy, but had, on the contrary, suppressed them because there could be only agreement between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks in the face of Lenin's position, exclamation point, end quote. Footnote, see Nikolai Sukhanov's The Russian Revolution of 1917. I'm going to look that book up. It's published with Princeton University Press, and it says, author of the only full-length eyewitness account of the 1917 revolution, Sukhanov was a key figure in the first revolutionary government. Sukhanov's 7-volume book, first published in 1922, was suppressed under Stalin. This reissue of the abridged version is, as the editor's preface points out, one of the few things written about this most dramatic and momentous event, which actually has the smell of life and gives us a feeling for the personalities, the emotions, and the play of ideas of the whole revolutionary period. Back to the text and footnote. The Pravda editorial of the 8th of April confirmed at the time that impressions of anti-Lenin unanimity. The Pravda editorial of the 8th of April confirmed at the time that impression of anti-Lenin unanimity. According to Sukhanov, quote, it seemed that the Marxist rank and file of the Bolshevik Party stood firm and unshakable, that the mass of the party was in revolt against Lenin to defend the elementary principles of the scientific socialism of the past. Alas, we were mistaken. End quote. Sukhanov. How are we to explain the extraordinary storm which Lenin's words raised in the course of general condemnation that came down on Lenin's words? Sukhanov's simple but revealing description suggests the reply. Lenin had done just that. He had broken with the, quote, scientific socialism of the past, end quote, with a particular way of understanding the, quote, elementary principles, end quote, of Marxism, a way which was to some extent common to all currents of Marxist social democracy in Russia. The perplexity, the confusion, the indignation, or the scorn with which the April theses had been received at one and the same time by Menshevik and Bolshevik leaders are only the symptoms of the radical break they imply with the Second International's tradition of, quote, orthodox Marxism. We refer to that of the ruling current, not to that of the radical left, Rosa Luxemburg, etc., a tradition for which materialism, mechanical, deterministic, evolutionary, was crystallized into a rigid and paralyzing political syllogism. Russia is a backward, barbarous, semi-feudal country. It is not ripe for socialism. The Russian Revolution is a bourgeois revolution. QED. I don't know what the hell that means. What does all caps QED mean? QED is an abbreviation for the Latin phrase quod erat demonstrandum, which means that which has to be demonstrated. It says, may appear at the conclusion of a text to signify that the author's overall argument has just been proven. Back to the text. Rarely has a turn in theory been richer in historic consequences than that inaugurated by Lenin in his speech at the Finland station in Petrograd. What were the methodological sources of that turn? What were the differentia specifica in method compared with the canons of the Marxist orthodoxy of the past? Here is Lenin's own reply, written in a polemic directed precisely against Sukhanov in January 1923, quote, they all call themselves Marxists, but their conception of Marxism is impossibly pedantic. They have completely failed to understand what is decisive in Marxism, namely Marxism's revolutionary dialectics, end quote. Footnote, see Lenin, Our Revolution, Collected Works, Volume 33, end footnote. Marxism's revolutionary dialectic, here in a nutshell, is the precise point of Lenin's break with the Marxism of the Second International, and to some extent with Lenin's own, quote, past philosophical consciousness. Here in a nutshell is the precise point of Lenin's break with the Marxism of the Second International, and to some extent with Lenin's own, quote, past philosophical consciousness. Beginning on the morrow of the First World War, the break was nourished by a return to the Hegelian sources of Marxist dialectics, coming to a head in the monumental, quote, mad, quote, raving challenge of the night of April 3rd, 1917. New section, quote, old Bolshevism or, quote, past Marxism. Lenin pre-1914. One of the chief sources of Lenin's political thinking prior to 1914 had been Marx's The Holy Family of 1844, which he had read and summarized in a notebook in 1895. I'm going to quickly read the Wikipedia for The Holy Family real quick. The Holy Family, or A Critique of Critical Critique, is a book written by Marx and Friedrich Engels in November 1844. The Holy Family is a critique of the young Hegelians and their trend of thought, which was very popular in academic circles at the time. The title was a suggestion by the publisher and is meant as a sarcastic reference to the Bauer brothers and their supporters. The book created a controversy with much of the press and caused Bruno Bauer to refute the book in an article which was published in Wegens Vierteljahrschrift in 1845. Bauer claimed that Marx and Engels misunderstood what he was saying. Marx later replied to this response with his own article that was published in the journal Gesellschaftsspiegel in January 1846. Marx also discussed the argument in the second chapter of The German Ideology. During Engels' short stay in Paris in 1844, Marx suggested that they should write together a critique of the rage of their day, the young Hegelians. While accomplishing their plan, the first joint writing project between them was accomplished, and thus the beginning of their friendship. After conversing, they began drawing up plans for a book about the young Hegelian trend of thought, very popular in academic circles. Agreeing to co-author the foreword, they divided up the other sections. Engels finished his assigned chapters before leaving Paris. Marx had the larger share of work, and he completed it. By the end of November 1844, Marx would draw from his economic and philosophic manuscripts, on which he had been working the spring and summer of 1844. The foremost title line, The Holy Family, was added at the suggestion of the book publisher Löwenthal. It is a sarcastic reference to the Bauer brothers, Bruno and Edgar, and their supporters amongst the Hegelians who had attempted a critical renovation of Christianity, hence the title, a critique of critical critique. Later, Marx will continue their sarcasm by referring to them as Saint Bruno, Saint Max, in reference to Max Stirner, etc. The book made something of a splash in the newspapers. One paper, bracket, which, question mark, that's from Wikipedia, and a bracket, noted that it expressed socialist views since it criticized the, quote, inadequacy of any half measures directed at eliminating the social ailments of our time, end quote. The Holy Family is among the earlier works of Marx and Engels, which discusses the concept behind the later coined term false consciousness. Marx describes how communist workers are able to break out of the false consciousness prevalent under capitalism. Quote, they, the communist workers, are most painfully aware of the difference between being and thinking, between consciousness and life. They know that property, capital, money, wage labor, and the like are no ideal figments of the brain, but very practical, very objective products of their self-estrangement, end quote. Marx and Engels, The Holy Family, Chapter 4, quote, critical criticism as the tranquility of knowledge, or, quote, critical criticism as Herr Edgar, section on Proudhon. And that's the end of the Wikipedia article. Back to the text. Lenin had been particularly interested by the chapter headed Critical Battle Against French Materialism, which Lenin described as, quote, one of the most valuable in the book, end quote. Footnote. See Lenin's Conspectus of the Holy Family in Collected Works, Volume 38. Wikipedia says French materialism is the name given to a handful of French 18th century philosophers during the Age of Enlightenment, many of them clustered around the salon of Baron de Holbach. Although there are important differences between them, all of them were materialists who believed that the world was made up of a single substance, matter, the motions and properties of which could be used to explain all phenomena. Prominent French materialists in the 18th century include Julien Offray, de la Mettrie, Denis Diderot, Baron de Holbach, Claude Adrien Helvetius, Pierre-Jean Georges Canabi, and Jacques-André Néguian. Back to the text. Now this chapter constitutes the only writing of Marx in which he quote, clings in non-critical fashion to the French materialism of the 18th century, which he presents as the, quote, logical basis, end quote, for communism. The quotations drawn from this chapter of the Holy Family provide one of those shibboleths which make possible the identification of, quote, metaphysical materialism in a Marxist current. On the other hand, it is a clear and well-known fact that Lenin was, at that time, greatly influenced in his philosophical outlook by Plekhanov. While being politically more flexible and radical than his master, who after the 1903 break became the principal theoretician of Menshevism, Lenin accepted certain fundamental ideological premises of Plekhanov's, quote, pre-dialectical Marxism and his strategic corollary, the bourgeois nature of the Russian Revolution. With this, quote, common basis, it is not difficult to understand how, despite his severe and intransigent criticism of the, quote, tailism of the Mensheviks in regard to the liberal bourgeoisie, he had been able to accept from 1905 to 1910 several attempts at reunification of the two factions of the Russian social democracy. Moreover, it was at the moment of his closest political rapprochement with Plekhanov against liquidationism in 1908 to 1909 that Lenin wrote Materialism and Imperial Criticism, a work in which the philosophical influence of the, quote, father of Russian Marxism, end quote, can be seen and read. What is remarkable and altogether characteristic of Lenin prior to 1914 is that the Marxist authority to whom Lenin often referred in his polemic against Plekhanov was none other than Karl Kautsky. For example, Lenin finds in an article by Kautsky of 1906 on the Russian Revolution, quote, a direct blow aimed at Plekhanov, end quote. And Lenin underlines enthusiastically the coincidence of the Kautskyist and Bolshevik analyses, quote, a bourgeois revolution brought about by the proletariat and the peasantry in spite of the instability of the bourgeoisie. This fundamental principle of Bolshevik tactics is wholly confirmed by Kautsky. End quote, Lenin. Footnote. See Lenin's preface to the Russian translation of Karl Kautsky's pamphlet, The Driving Forces and Prospects of the Russian Revolution, in Collected Works, Volume 11, Moscow, 1972. End footnote. A close analysis of Lenin's main political text of this period, The Two Tactics of Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution of 1905, reveals with extraordinary clarity the tension in Lenin's mind between his rich revolutionary realism and the limitations imposed on Lenin by the straitjacket of what was called, quote, orthodox Marxism. On the one hand, we find in it illuminating and penetrating analyses of the incapacity of the Russian bourgeoisie to lead successfully a democratic revolution, which can be carried out only by an alliance between the working class and peasantry exercising their revolutionary dictatorship. He even speaks of the leading role of the proletariat in this alliance, and, at times, seems to put his finger on the idea of an uninterrupted transition towards socialism. This dictatorship, quote, will be unable, without a series of intermediary stages of revolutionary development, to affect the foundations of capitalism, end quote. Footnote, see Lenin, Two Tactics of the Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution in Collected Works, Volume 9, end footnote. Where the hell am I? Okay, sorry. With this little parenthesis, Lenin opens a window on the unknown country of the socialist revolution, only to close it immediately to return to the closed area circumscribed by the limits of orthodoxy. These limits we find in numerous formulae in Two Tactics, where Lenin categorically reaffirms the bourgeois nature of the Russian Revolution and considers that, quote, the idea of seeking salvation for the working class in anything save the further development of capitalism is reactionary, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. On the previous page we read, quote, Marxists are absolutely convinced of the bourgeois character of the Russian Revolution. What does that mean? It means that the democratic reforms in the political system and the social and economic reforms that have become a necessity for Russia do not in themselves imply the undermining of capitalism, the undermining of bourgeois rule. On the contrary, they will, for the first time, really clear the ground for a wide and rapid European and not Asiatic development of capitalism. They will, for the first time, make it possible for the bourgeoisie to rule as a class, end quote. Lenin, Two Tactics of Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution. End footnote. The main argument Lenin offers to develop this thesis is the, quote, classic theme of, quote, pre-dialectical, end quote, Marxism. Russia is not ripe for socialist revolution. Quote, the degree of Russia's economic development and economic condition, quote, the degree of Russia's economic development an objective condition, and the degree of class consciousness and organization of the broad masses of the proletariat, a subjective condition inseparably bound up with the objective condition, make immediate and complete emancipation of the working class impossible. Only the most ignorant people can close their eyes to the bourgeois nature of the democratic revolution, which is now taking place, end quote. Lenin, Two Tactics of the Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. The objective determines the subjective. The economy is the condition of consciousness. Here in two phrases are the Moses and the Ten Commandments of the materialist gospel of the Second International, which weighed upon Lenin's rich political intuition. The formulation, which was the quintessence of pre-war Bolshevism, quote, old Bolshevism, reflects within itself all the ambiguities of the first Leninism. Quote, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, end quote. Lenin's profoundly revolutionary innovation, which marks it off radically from the Menshevik strategy, is expressed in the flexible and realistic formula of workers' and peasants' power. Of workers' and peasants' power, a formula of, quote, algebraic character, as Trotsky put it, where the specific weight of each class is not determined a priori. On the other hand, the apparently paradoxical term, quote, democratic dictatorship, is the shibboleth of orthodoxy, the visible presence of the limitations imposed by, quote, past Marxism. The revolution is only democratic, that is, bourgeois, a premise which, as Lenin wrote in a revealing passage, quote, flows necessarily from the whole of Marxist philosophy, end quote. That is to say, Marxist philosophy is conceived by Kautsky, Plekhanov, and other ideologists of what it was agreed to call, at the time, quote, revolutionary social democracy. Footnote, the only, or almost the only, exception to this iron rule was Trotsky. It was the first in Results and Prospects, the book of 1906, to go beyond the dogma of the bourgeois democratic nature of the future Russian Revolution. He was, however, politically neutralized by his organizational conciliationism. End footnote. Another theme in Two Tactics, which testifies to the methodological obstacle created by the analytical nature of that Marxism, is the explicit and formal rejection of the Paris Commune as a model for the Russian Revolution. According to Lenin, the Commune went wrong because the Commune was, quote, unable, to distinguish between the elements of a democratic revolution and a socialist revolution, end quote. Because it, quote, confused the task of fighting for a republic with those of fighting for socialism, end quote. Consequently, quote, it was a government which, as ours, bracket, the future provisional revolutionary government, Michael Löwy, end bracket, should not be, end quote. Lenin, Two Tactics of the Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. We shall see later that this is precisely one of the nodal points around which Leninism was to undertake, in April 1917, the heartbreaking revision of, quote, old Bolshevism. New section. The, quote, break of 1914. Quote, it's a fabrication of the German High Command, end quote, declared Lenin when they showed him the copy of Vorwärts, the organ of the German social democracy, with the news of the socialist vote for war credits on the 4th of August, 1914. Wikipedia says Vorwärts is a newspaper published by the Social Democratic Party of Germany, founded in 1876. Vorwärts was the central organ of the SPD for many decades. Following the party's Halle Congress in 1891, Vorwärts was published daily as the successor of Berliner Volksblatt, founded in 1884. Today it is published every 2 months, mailed to all SPD members. Back to the text. This famous story, like Lenin's stubborn refusal to believe that Plekhanov had supported the, quote, national defense, end quote, of Tsarist Russia, illustrates at one and the same time the illusions Lenin held about, quote, Marxist social democracy, Lenin's astonishment when confronted with the failure of the Second International, and the abyss that was opening between himself and the, quote, ex-orthodox who had become social patriots. The catastrophe of the 4th of August was for Lenin striking evidence that something was rotten in the state of Denmark of official, quote, orthodox Marxism. The political bankruptcy of that orthodoxy led Lenin, therefore, to a profound revision of the philosophical premises of the Marxism of Kautsky and Plekhanov. Quote, the failure of the Second International in the first days of the war incited Lenin to reflect on the theoretical foundations of so great a betrayal. End quote. Roger Garadi Lenin. Excuse me, did I say footnote? Footnote. See Roger Garadi Lenin. Sorry, I can't find any descriptions of that book. Roger Gardi went on to become a Holocaust denier. I do know that much. It will be necessary one day to retrace the precise track which led Lenin from the trauma of August 1914 to the logic of Hegel, scarcely a month after, the simple desire to return to the sources of Marxist thought, or a clear intuition that the methodological Achilles heel of the Marxism of the Second International was the non-comprehension of the dialectic. Science of Logic, first published between 1812 and 1816, is the work in which Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel outlined his vision of logic. Hegel's logic is a system of dialectics, i.e. a dialectical metaphysics. It is a development of the principle that thought and being constitute a single and active unity. Science of Logic also incorporates the traditional Aristotelian syllogism. It is conceived as a phase of the, quote, original unity of thought and being, end quote, rather than as a detached formal instrument of inference. For Hegel, the most important achievement of German idealism, starting with Immanuel Kant and culminating in his own philosophy, was the argument that reality, being, is shaped by thought and is, in a strong sense, identical to thought. Thus, ultimately, the structures of thought and being, subject and object, are identical, since for Hegel, the underlying structure of all reality is ultimately rational. Logic is not merely about reasoning or argument, but rather is also the rational structural core of all reality and every dimension of it. Thus, Hegel's science of logic includes, among other things, analyses of being, nothingness, becoming, existence, reality, essence, reflection, concept, and method. Hegel considers it one of his major works and therefore kept it up to date through revision. Science of logic is sometimes referred to as the greater logic, to distinguish it from the lesser logic, the moniker given to the condensed version Hegel presented as the, quote, logic section of his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. Back to the text. Whatever the reason, there is no doubt that his vision of the Marxist dialectic, Lenin's vision, was profoundly changed by it. Evidence of this is the text itself of the philosophical notebooks, and also the letter he sent on the 4th of January 1915, shortly after having finished reading The Science of Logic on the 17th of December 1914, to the editorial secretary of Granite Publishers, to ask if, quote, there was still time to make some corrections, bracket, to his, quote, Karl Marx, in the section on dialectics, end quote. Wikipedia says the Granat Encyclopedic Dictionary is a Russian encyclopedic dictionary originally published in 58 volumes with one supplement throughout both the Tsarist and Soviet periods. The dictionary's full title is the Encyclopedic Dictionary of the Granite Russian Bibliographical Institute. The word Granat refers to the last name of two brothers, Alexander, who lived from 1861 to 1933, and Ignati Granat, who lived from 1863 to 1941, who commissioned the articles in their Moscow office. Ignati Granat was later executed by shooting. First appearing in 1910, the dictionary was finally completed in 1948. The first 3 volumes were published in 1910 to 1917, and the remaining volumes from 1922 onwards. The dictionary's large size allowed each entry sufficient space to present relatively full information. Among the dictionary's contributors and editors were Vladimir Lenin, who wrote on Karl Marx, botanist Clement Timiryazev, anthropologist Dmitry Anuchin, biologist Ilya Mechnikov, and economist Alexander Konyas. Unlike the Brockhaus and Ephron Encyclopedic Dictionary, the Granat Encyclopedic Dictionary was written primarily by Russian authors. Back to the text. Oh, I also wanted to look up philosophical notebooks. Wikipedia says the philosophical notebooks of Lenin were a series of summaries and commentaries on philosophical works by Lenin. Included were works by Aristotle, Hegel, Feuerbach, Marx, and Debrin, bracket, citation needed, end bracket. Lenin's notes on dialectics played an influential role in Soviet and Chinese studies on contradiction and the unity of opposites. The notebooks are often contrasted by scholars with Lenin's materialism and imperial criticism. The proper interpretation of the notebooks would play a major role in the mechanist debate of the 1920s in the USSR and the one divides into two controversy of 1964 in China. Back to the text. And it was by no means a, quote, passing enthusiasm, end quote, as 7 years later in one of his last writings, titled On the Significance of Militant Materialism of 1922, he called on the editor and contributors of the party's theoretical journal, under the banner of Marxism, to, quote, be a kind of, quote, society of materialist friends of Hegelian dialectics, end quote, end quote. Lenin insisted on the need for a, quote, systematic study of the Hegelian dialectic from a materialist standpoint, end quote, and proposed even to, quote, print in the journal excerpts from Hegel's principal works, interpret them materialistically, and comment on them with the help of examples of the way Marx applied dialectics, end quote. Footnote, see Lenin's On the Significance of Militant Materialism in Collected Works, Volume 33. This is very contemporary today when attempts are being made once more to write off old Hegel on Lenin's authority. And footnote. It's probably a reference to Althusser. What were the tendencies, or at least the attempts, in the Marxism of the Second International, which gave it its pre-dialectical character? In the first instance, primarily the tendency to efface the distinction between Marx's dialectical materialism and the, quote, ancient, quote, vulgar, quote, metaphysical materialism of Helvetius, Feuerbach, etc. Plekhanov, for example, could write these astonishing lines, quote, in Marx's theses on Feuerbach, none of the fundamental ideas of Feuerbach's philosophy are refuted. They merely amend them. ... The materialist views of Marx and Engels have been elaborated in the direction indicated by the inner logic of Feuerbach's philosophy." End quote. What is more, Plekhanov criticized Feuerbach and the French materialists of the 18th century for having too ... idealist an outlook in the domain of history. Footnote. See Plekhanov's Fundamental Problems of Marxism. Quote, Marxist theory of cognition is directly derived from Feuerbach's. If you like, we can even say that, strictly speaking, it is Feuerbach's theory given a profounder meaning in a general way by Marx. End quote. End footnote. Where am I? Secondly, the tendency which flows from the first to reduce historical materialism to mechanical economic determinism, in which the quote objective is always the cause of the quote subjective. For example, Kautsky untiringly insists on the idea that quote the domination of the proletariat and the social revolution cannot come about before the preliminary conditions, as much economic as psychological, of a socialist society are sufficiently realized. End quote. What are these quote psychological conditions? End quote. According to Kautsky, quote, intelligence, discipline, and an organizational talent. End quote. How will these conditions be created? Quote, it is the historic task of capitalism, end quote, to realize them. The moral of history, quote, it is only where the capitalist system of production has attained a high degree of development, the economic conditions permit the transformation, by the power of the people, of capitalist property and the means of production into social ownership. End quote. Kautsky, The Social Revolution. End footnote. Thirdly, the attempt to reduce the dialectic to Darwinian evolution, where the different stages of human history, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, follow a sequence rigorously determined by the, quote, laws of history. Kautsky, for example, defines Marxism as, quote, the scientific study of the evolution of the social organism, end quote. Kautsky. Or footnote, Kautsky, The Agrarian Question. Plekhanov, on the other hand, had, at least in principle, criticized vulgar evolutionism, basing himself on Hegel's Science of Logic. The Google Books says, for the agrarian question, says, Lenin described the agrarian question as the first systematic Marxist study of capitalism and agriculture and the most important event in economic literature since the third volume of Capital. This great work is regarded as Kautsky's main achievement and is a classic work of analysis. Kautsky's pariah status in the eyes of revolutionary Marxists resulted in many years of neglect, but Kautsky's role and work are now commanding great attention. The analysis of the transformation of peasant economies by capital in the agrarian question is now seen as particularly relevant to contemporary third world peasant economies. This remarkable translation, which brings out the humanity and the humor in Kautsky's writing, is more than a work of economic analysis. In a manner ahead of his time, Kautsky integrates questions of political strategy, ecology, sexuality, and the family, the illuminating reassessment of the agrarian question in the introduction by Professor Theodore Shannon and Hamza Alavi examines in detail the political context, Kautsky's own life, the development of Kautsky's ideas within the work, and its contribution to our understanding of the world. Back to the text. Kautsky had in fact been a Darwinian before becoming a Marxist. And it is not without reason that Kautsky's disciple Brill defined his method as, quote, biohistorico-materialism. Sorry, I'm trying to see who this Brill person is. I don't know if they're related to Brill Publishers. It's hard to say because Brill Publishers publishes so many Marxist books that I don't know if there's a Brill, if this Brill is related or not. Back to the text. Fourthly, an abstract and naturalistic conception of the, quote, laws of history, strikingly illustrated by the marvelous pronouncement of Plekhanov when he heard the news of the October Revolution, quote, but it's a violation of all the laws of history, end quote. I don't see any citation for that. Fifthly, a tendency to relapse into the analytical method, grasping only, quote, distinct and separate, end quote, objects, fixed in their differences, Russia, Germany, bourgeois revolution, socialist revolution, party masses, minimum program, maximum program, etc. It is clearly understood that Kautsky and Plekhanov had carefully read and studied Hegel, but they had not, so to speak, quote, absorbed and, quote, digested Hegel into their preceding systems of evolutionism and historical determinism. How far did Lenin's notes on or about Hegel's logic constitute a challenge to pre-dialectical materialism? In the first instance, Lenin primarily insists on the philosophical abyss separating, quote, stupid, that is, quote, metaphysical, undeveloped, dead, crude, end quote, materialism, from Marxist materialism, which on the contrary is nearer to, quote, intelligent, that is, dialectical idealism. Consequently, Lenin severely criticizes Plekhanov for having written nothing on Hegel's great logic, quote, that is to say, basically on the dialectic as philosophical knowledge, end quote, and for having criticized Kant from the standpoint of vulgar materialism rather than in the manner of Hegel. Footnote, see Lenin's Conspectus of Hegel's Science of Logic and Conspectus of Hegel's Lectures on the History of Philosophy. Secondly, he acquires for himself a dialectical understanding of causality. Quote, cause and effect, ergo, are merely moments of universal reciprocal dependence, of universal connection, of the reciprocal connection of events, ... end quote. At the same time, he approves the dialectical process by which Hegel dissolves the, quote, opposition of solid and abstract, of subjective and objective, and destroys their one-sidedness, end quote. Lenin. Conspectus of Hegel's Science of Logic. And footnote, where am I? Thirdly, Lenin underlines the major difference between the vulgar evolutionist conception and the dialectical conception of development. Quote, the first, bracket, development as decrease and increase, as repetition, end bracket, is lifeless, pale, and dry. The second, bracket, development is unity of opposites, end bracket, alone furnishes the key to the, quote, leaps, to the, quote, break in continuity, to the, quote, transformation into the opposite, end quote, to the destruction of the old and emergence of the new, end quote. Lenin, on the question of dialectics. Fourthly, with Hegel, Lenin struggles, quote, against making the concept of law absolute, against simplifying the concept of law, making a fetish of the concept of law, end quote. And adds, quote, NB for modern physics, end quote. Lenin writes likewise that, quote, all laws are narrow, incomplete, approximate, end quote. Lenin. Fifthly, Lenin sees in the category of sum total, in the development of the entire ensemble of the moments of reality, the essence of dialectical cognition. We can see the use Lenin made immediately of this methodological principle in the pamphlet he wrote at the time, The Collapse of the Second International. Lenin submits to severe criticism the apologists of, quote, national defense, who attempt to deny the imperialist character of the Great War because of the, quote, national factor of the war of the Serbs against Austria, by underlining that Marx's dialectic, quote, correctly excludes any isolated examination of an object, that is one-sided and monstrously distorted, end quote. Lenin. In Collapse of the Second International. This is of capital importance, and footnote. This is of capital importance since, as Lukács says, the reign of the dialectical category of sum total brings the revolutionary principle into science. The isolation, fixation, separation, and abstract opposition of different moments of reality are resolved in part through the category of sum total, in part by the statement of Lenin's that, quote, the dialectic is the theory which shows ... why human understanding should not take contraries as dead and petrified, but as living, conditioned, mobile, interpenetrating each other, end quote. Obviously, what interests us here is less the study of the philosophical content of the notebooks, quote, in themselves, than the philosophical content of the notebooks' political consequences. Their political consequences. It is not difficult to find the red thread leading from the methodological premises of the notebooks to Lenin's theses of 1917, from the category of sum total to the theory of the weakest link in the imperialist chain, from the interpenetration of opposites to the transformation of the democratic revolution into the socialist revolution, from the dialectical conception of causality to the refusal to define the character of the Russian Revolution solely by Russia's, quote, economically backward base, end quote. From the critique of vulgar evolutionism to the, quote, break in continuity, end quote, in 1917, and so on, and so on. But what is most important is quite simply that the critical reading, the materialist reading of Hegel, had freed Lenin from the straitjacket of the pseudo-orthodox Marxism of the Second International, from the theoretical limitation it imposed on his thinking. The study of Hegelian logic was the instrument by means of which Lenin cleared the theoretical road leading to the Finland station in Petrograd. In March-April 1917, freed from the obstacle represented by pre-dialectical Marxism, Lenin could, under the pressure of events, rid Lenin's self in good time of pre-dialectical Marxism's political corollary. The abstract and rigid principle according to which, quote, the Russian Revolution could only be bourgeois because Russia was not economically ripe for socialist revolution, end quote. Once Lenin crossed the Rubicon, Lenin applied himself to studying the problem from a practical, concrete, and realistic angle. What are the measures constituting, in fact, the transition towards socialism that can be made acceptable to the majority of the people, that is, the masses of the workers and peasants? New section, section 3, the April Theses of 1917. The truth is that the April Theses were born in March, more exactly between the 11th and 26th of March, that is to say, between the 3rd and 5th letters from afar. Close analysis of these two documents which, by the way, were not published in 1917, allows us to grasp the very moment of Lenin's thought, the very movement of Lenin's thought. To the main question, can the Russian Revolution take transitional measures towards socialism? Lenin replies in two ways. In the first, letter 3, Lenin questions the traditional answer. In the second, letter 5, he gives a new reply. Letter 3 in itself contains two juxtaposed moments in unresolved contradiction. Lenin describes certain concrete measures in the sphere of control of production and distribution, which Lenin considers indispensable for the advance of the revolution. Lenin first underlines that these measures are not yet socialism, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. These measures do not go beyond the limits of the, quote, revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, end quote. But Lenin immediately adds, this paradoxical short passage which clearly suggests a doubt about what Lenin has just said, that is, an explicit questioning to the, quote, classical, end quote, theses. Quote, it is not a matter of finding a theoretical classification. We would be committing a great mistake if we attempted to force the complex, urgent, rapidly developing practical tasks of the revolution into the Procrustean bed of cut-and-dried theory, ... end quote. Lenin, Letters from Afar, Collected Works. 15 days later, in the fifth letter, the abyss has been crossed, the political break consummated, quote, in their entirety and in their development, these steps, bracket, control of production and distribution, etc., end bracket, will mark the transition to socialism, which cannot be achieved in Russia directly, at one stroke, without transitional measures, but is quite achievable and urgently necessary as a result of such transitional measures, end quote. Lenin no longer refuses to make a, quote, theoretical classification of these measures, and he defines them not as, quote, democratic, but as transitional to socialism. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks in Petrograd remained loyal to the old schema. They were trying to lay the Russian Revolution, that unmanageable, unconquered, and liberated maid, in the Procrustean bed of petrified theory, ... and were sitting tight in prudent silence. Pravda of the 15th of March even gave conditional support to the provisional cadet government, quote, to the extent that it fights the reaction and counter-revolution, end quote. According to the frank statement of the Bolshevik leader Shliapnikov in March 1917, quote, we agreed with the Mensheviks that we were passing through the period of the breakdown of feudal relations, and that in their place would appear all kinds of, quote, freedoms proper to bourgeois regimes, end quote. Shliapnikov. Footnote. See Trotsky's The History of the Russian Revolution, end footnote. One can understand, then, their surprise when the first words Lenin addressed at the Finland station in Petrograd to the crowd of workers, soldiers, and sailors were a call to struggle for socialist revolution. See F. Somilov, Memoirs of Lenin, in Lenin tel qu'il fut. I don't fucking know. Something in French. End footnote. Oh shit, the footnote's not over. See also the stenographic notes of Lenin's first speech taken by the Bolshevik Branch Brevich at the railway station. Quote, you must struggle for the socialist revolution, struggle to the end, till the complete victory of the proletariat. Long live the socialist revolution, end quote. End footnote. Sorry for that long pause. And also the hacking and wheezing. On the evening of the 3rd of April, and on the next day, he revealed the April Theses, which produced, according to the Bolshevik Zalewski, a member of the Petrograd Committee, the effect of an exploding bomb. The effect of an exploding bomb. Moreover, on the 8th of April, this same Petrograd Committee rejected Lenin's theses by 13 votes to 2, with one abstention. Rejected Lenin's theses by 13 votes to 2, with one abstention. Footnote. C. E. H. Carr, The Bolshevik Revolution. Quote, nobody had yet contested the view that the Russian Revolution was not and could not be other than a bourgeois revolution. This was the solid and accepted framework of doctrine into which policy had to fit. Yet it was difficult to discover within this framework any cogent reason to reject out of hand the provisional government, which was indubitably bourgeois, or at least a transfer of power to the Soviets, which were essentially proletarian, or, least of all, to denounce the quest for a, quote, democratic peace and preach civil war and national defeat. It was left to Lenin, before the eyes of his astonished followers, to smash the framework, end quote. E. H. Carr. See also the testimony of the Bolshevik Olminsky, quoted by Trotsky, quote, the coming revolution was to be only a bourgeois revolution, ... That was an obligatory premise for every member of the party, the official opinion of the party, its continual and unchanging slogan right up to the February Revolution of 1917, and even some time after, end quote. Olminsky. End footnote. And it must be said that the April theses were to some extent a retreat from the conclusions already reached in the fifth of the, quote, letters from afar. They do not speak explicitly of the transition to socialism. It seems that Lenin, in face of the astonishment and perplexity of his comrades, was forced to moderate his words somewhat. In fact, the April theses do speak of the transition between the first stage of the revolution and the second, quote, which must give the power to the proletariat and the layers of the poor peasants, end quote. But that is not necessarily in contradiction with the traditional formula of the old Bolshevism, except for the mention of the, quote, layers of the poor peasants, end quote, instead of the peasantry as a whole, which is clearly very significant. Since the content of the tasks of this power, democratic only or already socialist, is not defined. Lenin even underlines that, quote, it is not our immediate task to, quote, introduce socialism, but only to bring social production and the distribution of products at once under the control of the Soviets of Workers' Deputies, end quote. Lenin. A flexible formula where the character of the content of this, quote, control is not defined. The only theme which, at least implicitly, is a revision of the former Bolshevik conception is that of the state commune as a model for the Republic of Soviets, and for two reasons. Firstly, traditionally, the commune had been defined, in Marxist literature, as the first attempt at the dictatorship of the proletariat. And secondly, Lenin himself had characterized the commune as a workers' government, which had wished to carry through simultaneously a democratic and a socialist revolution. That was why Lenin, prisoner of, quote, past Marxism, end quote, had criticized the commune in 1905. For the same reason, Lenin, the revolutionary dialectician, took it as a model in 1917. The historian E.H. Carr is, therefore, correct in underlining that Lenin's first articles after his arrival in Petrograd, quote, implied the transition to socialism, though it stopped short of explicitly proclaiming it, end quote. E.H. Carr. Explication was to be made during the month of April, in proportion as Lenin won the rank and file of the Bolshevik Party to his political line. It was made especially around two axes, the revision of, quote, old Bolshevism, and the perspective of the transition to socialism. The major text on this subject is a small pamphlet, not well known, Letters on Tactics, composed during the 8th to the 13th of April, probably under the pressure of the anti-Lenin editorial in Pravda on the 8th of April. There we find the key phrase which summarizes the historic turn Lenin made, and it is definitive, explicit, and radical break with what had become outlived in the, quote, past Bolshevism. Quote, the person who now speaks only of a, quote, revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote, is behind the times. Consequently, he has in effect gone over to the petite bourgeoisie against the proletarian class struggle. That person should be consigned to the archive of, quote, Bolshevik pre-revolutionary antiques. It may be called the archive of, quote, old Bolsheviks, end quote, end quote. Footnote, see Lenin's Letters on Tactics and Collected Works, Volume 24. Lenin adds, quote, is this reality covered by Comrade Kamenev's old Bolshevik formula, which says that, quote, the democratic revolution is not completed, end quote. It is not. The formula is obsolete. It is no good at all. It is dead, and it is no use trying to revive it, end quote. Lenin, Letters on Tactics, Collected Works, Volume 24. End footnote. In this same pamphlet, while defending himself against wishing to introduce socialism, quote, immediately, Lenin declares that the Soviet power would take, quote, steps, towards socialism, end quote. For example, quote, control over a bank, the merging of all banks into one, is not yet socialism, but is a step towards socialism, end quote. Lenin. In an article published on the 23rd of April, Lenin defined in the following terms what distinguished the Bolsheviks from the Mensheviks. While the Mensheviks are, quote, for socialism, but it is too early to think of it or to take any immediate practical steps for its realization, end quote. The former think the, quote, Soviets must immediately take all possible practical steps for its realization, end quote. Lenin, in Political Parties in Russia and the Tasks of the Proletariat. End footnote. What does, quote, possible practical steps, end quote, for the realization of socialism mean? For Lenin, it means especially the measures that can receive the support of the majority of the population. The measures that can receive the support of the majority of the population. That is, not only of the workers, but also of the peasant masses. Lenin, freed from the theoretical limitation imposed by the pre-dialectical schema, quote, the going over to socialism is objectively unrealizable, end quote, is now occupied with real political social conditions to ensure, quote, steps toward socialism, end quote. So, in Lenin's speech to the 8th Congress of the Bolshevik Party on the 24th to the 29th of April, Lenin posed the problem in a realistic and concrete way. Quote, what we should talk about, however, are concrete steps and measures. We cannot be for, quote, introducing socialism. This would be the height of absurdity. We must preach socialism. The majority of the population in Russia are peasants, small farmers who can have no idea of socialism. But what objections can they have to a bank being set up in each village to enable them to improve their farming? They can say nothing against it. We must put over these practical measures to the peasants in our propaganda and make the peasants realize that they are necessary. End quote. Lenin. Footnote. That quotes from Lenin's Report on the Central Committee in Collected Works, Volume 24. End footnote. The quote, introduction of socialism in this context means the immediate imposition of socialism, quote, from above, against the will of the majority of the population. Lenin, on the contrary, proposes getting the support of the peasant masses for certain concrete measures of an objectively socialist character taken by the Soviet power with workers' leadership. To within a few degrees, this conception is astonishingly like that defended by Trotsky since 1905, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat supported by the peasantry, end quote, that affects the uninterrupted going over from the democratic revolution to the socialist. So it is not by chance that Lenin was regarded as a, quote, Trotskyist by the, quote, old Bolshevik Kamenev in April 1917. Footnote. See Trotsky's The Permanent Revolution, chapters 3 and 4. It should not be forgotten, on the other hand, that for Lenin as much as for Trotsky, there was a, quote, objective limit for socialism in Russia, to the extent that a completely socialist society, abolition of classes, etc., could not be established in an isolated and backward country. End footnote. Sorry about that. Conclusion. There is no doubt that the April Theses represent a, quote, break in theory and policy with the pre-war tradition of Bolshevism. That said, it is nonetheless true that, to the extent that Lenin had since 1905 preached the revolutionary alliance of the proletariat and the peasantry, and the radical deepening of the revolution without, or even against the liberal bourgeoisie, the, quote, new Bolshevism, born in April 1917, is the true heir and legitimate child of the, quote, old Bolshevism. On the other hand, if it is undeniable that the philosophical notebooks constitute a philosophical break with the, quote, first Leninism, it must be recognized that the methods in action in the political writings of pre-1914 Lenin were much more, quote, dialectical than those of Plekhanov or Kautsky. Finally, and to avoid any possible misunderstanding, we in no way wish to suggest that Lenin, quote, deduced the April Theses from Hegel's logic, The theses are the product of revolutionary realistic thinking in the face of a new situation, the World War, the objectively revolutionary situation it created in Europe, the February Revolution, the rapid defeat of Tsarism, the massive appearance of the Soviets. They are the result of what constitutes the very essence of the Leninist method, concrete analysis of a concrete situation. Concrete analysis of a concrete situation. The critical reading of Hegel helped Lenin to free himself from an abstract, cut-and-dried theory that was an obstacle to this concrete analysis. The pre-dialectical pseudo-orthodoxy of the Second International. It is in this sense, and in this sense only, that we can speak of the theoretical journey that led Lenin from the study of the great logic in the library of Berna in September 1914 to the challenging speech that, quote, shook the world, launched for the first time on the night of the 3rd of April 1917 in the Finland station in Petrograd. The end. Thank you so much for listening.